There's something almost invisible that happens when an avoidant loses an empath, and most people miss it because on the surface it doesn't look dramatic. There's no public breakdown, no grand confession, no immediate spiral. In fact, if you were watching from the outside, you might even think they're doing fine, maybe even better. But what actually happens spiritually is much deeper than what shows up in texts left unanswered or social media silence. When an avoidant loses an empath, it's not just a breakup. It's the sudden removal of a mirror, a regulator, an energetic anchor they didn't even consciously realize they were leaning on. And the truth is, the shift doesn't start with pain, it starts with relief. That's the part nobody talks about. The first feeling isn't heartbreak, it's space, it's air, it's quiet. It's the absence of emotional intensity. For someone wired to fear engulfment, that space can feel like freedom, like they escaped something overwhelming, like they can finally breathe without someone needing depth, vulnerability, reassurance. But spiritually, that relief is the calm before something much heavier. Because it's when you remove the one person who was holding emotional space for you, even if you resisted it, the energy doesn't just disappear. It leaves a vacuum. At first, the avoidant convinces themselves this was necessary. They tell themselves the connection was too much, too emotional, too demanding. They replay moments when they felt pressured to open up. They highlight the intensity. They focus on the times they felt misunderstood. And for a while, that narrative works. The burner porks, the nervous system, which was constantly activated by closeness, finally gets a break. No more long emotional talks, no more feeling seen in places that felt vulnerable, no more subtle expectation to go deeper. There's comfort and detachment. There's safety and distance. And spiritually, this is the ego regaining control because vulnerability feels like risk. And losing an empath in the beginning feels like regaining control over that risk. But control is not the same thing as peace. And that's where the shift begins. Because when the initial relief fades, when the silence stretches longer than expected, when distractions stop hitting the same, something subtle starts happening internally. The body starts noticing what the mind tried to override. The nervous system that once calmed down in the presence of someone safe begins to feel slightly off, slightly ungrounded. There's no obvious reason for it. Nothing catastrophic happened, but there's an undercurrent of restlessness because whether they admitted it or not, the empathetic presence regulated them. This is where the nervous system crash begins. Avoidants don't process loss the way others do. They suppress first and feel later. So while they appear stable, externally, internally, the body starts recalibrating. Sleep may shift, energy levels fluctuate. There's a low-grade anxiety that wasn't there before, not because they consciously missed the person, but because their system had adapted to having that emotional anchor. Empaths often provide steady reassurance, subtle validation, grounding energy, even when the avoidant pushed away. That presence was stabilizing, and now it's gone. The body doesn't understand pride. It doesn't understand ego narratives. It understands safety cues. And one of its safety cues just disappeared. That's why spiritually the loss begins beneath awareness. It's not about dramatic longing. It's about the slow recognition that something regulating is no longer there. And the silence that once felt freeing begins to feel loud. Because when the empath leaves, they don't just take conversations with them. They take energetic presence. Empaths love in a way that extends beyond words. They anticipate needs. They soften tension. They absorb emotional undercurrents. They check in. They hold space. And even if the avoidant claimed they didn't need that, their nervous system knew otherwise. So when that energy disappears, there's a kind of withdrawal. Not from the person alone, but from the feeling of being emotionally buffered. And withdrawal doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like irritability, restlessness, a sudden urge to distract, a need to fill the space quickly with work, hobbies, new faces, noise, because if they sit still long enough, they'll start to feel the emptiness. And that emptiness isn't just about missing someone. It's about losing the version of themselves that only existed in the presence of someone who saw them deeply. This is when the silence gets loud. Without someone initiating emotional depth, without someone asking thoughtful questions, without someone gently pulling layers back, the avoidant is left alone with their own inner world. And that world is usually the place they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Distractions work for a while. They always do, but eventually there's a moment, maybe late at night, maybe during a quiet drive, maybe when something reminds them of a shared memory where the noise fades. And whatever places it isn't dramatic heartbreak, it's awareness. Awareness of the quiet, awareness of the absence, awareness of the fact that nobody is there reaching in anymore. And spiritually, that's confrontational because the empathide wasn't just a partner, they were a mirror. They reflected wounds gently. They noticed patterns. They held up compassion where there was self-criticism. And now that mirror is gone, without that reflection, something unsettling happens. The avoidant can no longer project discomfort outward as easily. There's no one to label as to, oh, emotional in the room, no one to blame for intensity, no one asking for more. So the emotional undercurrents that were once activated by closeness begin surfacing in solitude. And this is where the ego fights back hardest. The mind starts reinforcing narratives to maintain control. It wasn't aligned, it was too draining, it wouldn't have worked long term. These thoughts aren't always malicious, they're protective. They're attempts to prevent vulnerability from resurfacing. Because to admit the loss hurts would mean admitting the connection mattered, and to admit it mattered would mean confronting why it felt threatening in the first place. Spiritually, losing an empath begins peeling layers off slowly, not all at once, not dramatically, but persistently. The initial relief phase gives way to subtle restlessness. The restlessness gives way to moments of unexpected emotion. Maybe a song hits differently. Maybe a memory surface is uninvited. Maybe they find themselves opening a message thread just to reread something. And each time that happens, there's a split second of clarity before the walls go back up. A split second where they recognize the depth of what they had, but vulnerability is uncomfortable territory. So the ego reasserts control, it minimizes, it rationalizes, it reframes the loss as necessary. Yet beneath that narrative, something deeper is shifting, because spiritually you can't disconnect from someone who saw your shadow and still cared without feeling it eventually. The empath created emotional safety, even if didn't always look perfect. They created a space where the avoidant could soften, even if only briefly. And losing that safety activates something ancient, something rooted in early attachment. The fear of being truly known and then alone. That fear is layered. It's buried under independence, under logic, under self-sufficiency. But when the empath leaves, it stirs. And at first, it doesn't register as fear. It registers as distance, as detachment, as I'm fine. But spiritually, the process has already started. The removal of unconditional presence creates a vacuum that forces introspection. Whether the avoidant leans into that introspection or runs from it determines everything that follows. But make no mistake, the shift has begun. Because when someone who loved you deeply walks away, especially someone who loved you without trying to control you, without trying to diminish you, without trying to diminish you, without trying to own you, it does something to your spirit. Even if you pretended you didn't need it, even if you told yourself you were better off without intensity, even if you convinced yourself distance was strength, the absence becomes a teacher, a quiet one at first, but persistent. And the more silence stretches on, the harder it becomes to ignore the echo of what was there. The relief fades, the nervous system recalibrates, the energetic withdrawal deepens, the silence confronts, and the ego works over time to maintain stability. But underneath it all, something real is happening, something transformative, because losing an empath doesn't just remove a person, it removes a layer of protection the avoidant didn't even know they were leaning on. And that's where the spiritual unraveling truly begins, because once the initial shock, the relief, and the ego defenses settle into a fragile routine, something far more destabilizing happens beneath the surface. The mirror is gone. And when the mirror disappears, so does the version of you that only existed when someone was reflecting your depth back to you. An empath that doesn't just listen, they witness, they don't just respond, they absorb, they don't just stay, they hold space in a way that makes even the most guarded person feel quietly understood. And when that kind of presence eads, the avoidant doesn't just lose a relationship, they lose the reflection of their softer self, the version that almost opened up, the version that almost trusted fully, the version that felt seen without being judged. Without that reflection, it becomes easier to slip back into the familiar armor. But something feels off because deep down they know that armor came off, even if only slightly, with that one person. And now there's no one gently showing them who they could be beyond the walls. Spiritually, this is disorienting because the empath acted as a compassionate mirror, reflecting not just wounds but potential. And when that reflection vanishes, the avoidant is left alone with their unfiltered inner world without the softening effect of someone who saw the beauty inside the chaos. As days stretch into weeks, another layer reveals itself. The loss of emotional safety. Avoidance often equate closeness with danger, but what many don't consciously realize is that when the closeness is with someone safe, someone patient, someone emotionally grounded, their system begins to adapt to that safety. It may resist it at first, it may test it, it may pull away and come back. But over time, the body recognizes consistency. The empathy becomes a quiet anchor, and when that anchor is suddenly gone, there's a subtle freefall that begins internally. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. They still function, they still work, they still socialize. But there's a background hum of instability, a sense that something stabilizing is missing. And here's the part that hits deeper than most people expect. The avoidant may not consciously miss the empath at first, but their nervous system does. Their body remembers the steady reassurance. Their subconscious remembers the way conflict didn't automatically lead to abandonment. Their heart remembers feeling accepted in moments they expect. Said rejection, so when that safety disappears, old attachment wounds start whispering again. The very wounds they've spent a lifetime trying to outrun. Then comes the delayed grief wave, and this is where things start to get real. Avoidants don't grieve in real time. They postpone it, they intellectualize it, they compartmentalize it. They move forward before they've processed what they left behind. But grief is patient, it waits. It waits for the distractions to lose their shine. It waits for the new routines to feel ordinary. It waits for a random trigger, a scent, a place, a quiet evening to crack the door open. It rushes in. Suddenly the weight of what was lost isn't theoretical anymore. It's felt not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in a heavy, wasn't easily replaceable, that the empathy, the patience, the depth, the emotional intelligence, they weren't common. And that maybe, just maybe, they walked away from something rare. This grief doesn't always show up as tears. Sometimes it shows up as regret disguised as nostalgia. Sometimes it shows up as longing disguised as curiosity. Sometimes it shows up as checking a social media profile just to see. But spiritually, this is the moment the walls begin to crack, because once grief is felt, even briefly, it can't be unfelt. And then something even stranger begins to happen. The dreams start. Out of nowhere, the empath appears in their subconscious, not always in dramatic scenarios, sometimes in simple ones. Talking, laughing, existing, and the avoidant wakes up with a lingering feeling they can't quite shake. Throughout the day, memories surface without invitation. Not just the intense moments, but the quiet ones, the way they were looked at with softness, the way conflicts were handled with patience, the way they were understood without over-explaining. And these memories don't come as punishment, they come as reminders. Spiritually, when a connection carried emotional depth, the subconscious doesn't just erase it because the conscious mind decided to move on. The bond lingers in layers. The avoidant can't fully control. And that's when confusion sets in, because they thought they were fine. They told themselves they were fine. But if they were fine, why does the memory still carry warmth? Why does the thought of the empathy with someone else sting unexpectedly? Why does silence sometimes feel heavier than before? This is where the energetic cord becomes undeniable. Even in separation, emotional bonds don't dissolve instantly. Even in separation, emotional bonds, especially when one person loved deeply and the other allowed themselves, if only briefly, to be vulnerable. The avoidant may start feeling random emotional pulls, sudden urges to reach out that they quickly suppress, moments of sadness that don't seem connected to anything happening in the present, and they won't label it spiritual. They won't frame it as energetic. They'll rationalize it as boredom or habit. But the truth is, when someone impacts you at a soul level, the absence doesn't just remove them physically. It creates an energetic gap, and that gap can be felt long after pride says it shouldn't be. They may find themselves typing a message and deleting it, imagining a conversation and dismissing it, wondering if the empath is okay, and convincing themselves it's none of their concern. And each time they silence that impulse, there's a small internal conflict, because pride says, stay distant. Ego says, don't look back. But something softer, something quieter says, you lost something meaningful. And here's the part that makes this spiritual shift unavoidable. The empath is no longer chasing. They're no longer overextending. They're no longer trying to prove the worth their bond. And in that absence, the avoidant no longer has emotional reassurance waiting in the background. There's no safety net of unconditional understanding. No guarantee that if they come back, everything will resume as it was, that certainty is gone. And with it comes a new awareness. Loss is real, not abstract, not temporary, real. And once that awareness sets in, the internal narrative starts to shift. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably, the avoidant begins to recognize that independence, while empowering did not replace connection. That space, while relieving, did not equate to fulfillment. That emotional intensity, while uncomfortable, was also intimacy. And intimacy, once experienced authentically, leaves an imprint. This is the spiritual crossroads phase. Even if it hasn't fully surfaced yet, the mirror is gone. The emotional safety is gone. The delayed grief has begun. The dreams and memories are surfacing. The energetic pull lingers. And now the avoidant is left with a choice they don't consciously realize they're facing. Numb out and repeat the cycle, or sit with the discomfort long enough to understand why losing someone who loved them felt both relieving and devastating at the same time. That paradox is the lesson, because when you lose an empath, you don't just lose affection, you lose the opportunity to grow in the presence of someone who saw beyond your defenses. And whether you admit it or not, that kind of loss changes you. So if you're watching this from the outside, if you were the one who loved deeply, who held space, who tried to understand, know this: what looks like indifference isn't the whole story. What looks like ease isn't the full picture. The spiritual impact doesn't always explode outward. Sometimes it unfolds in silence. Sometimes it stretches across months. Sometimes it hits when they least expect it. But when someone says a connection that challenged them to soften, that invited them to heal, that loved them in ways they weren't used to receiving, it does not leave them untouched. It lingers, it teaches, it confronts. And whether they evolve because of it or retreat further into old patterns. And that's the next chapter, the one where everything they built their identity around begins to quietly collapse. Because when the emotional dust settles and the silence becomes normal, the avoidant eventually runs into a truth they can't outrun forever. The "I don't need anyone" identity starts cracking. For years, maybe decades, independence was survival. Self-sufficiency was armor. Not relying on anyone meant not being disappointed, not being abandoned, not being engulfed. It felt strong, it felt controlled, it felt safe. But losing an empath exposes the difference between independence and isolation. And that realization doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in through subtle moments, through achievements that feel oddly empty because there's no one emotionally safe to share them with, through hard days where they realize they miss having someone who didn't just hear about their stress but felt it with them, through quiet nights where the strength of being alone starts to feel less like empowerment and more like distance. The persona of "I'm better off alone" begins to feel thin because they weren't just with anyone, they were with someone who made solitude less necessary. And now solitude is all they have again. This is where the glow-up effect begins to sting in a way pride can't fully suppress. Because while the avoidant is wrestling internally, the empath is healing, re-entering, reclaiming their energy. When someone who gave deeply stops giving, their energy doesn't disappear. It returns to them. And that return creates a shift. The empath becomes calmer, more grounded, less reactive, more self-focused. And energetically, that shift can be felt even from a distance. The avoidant may not consciously understand why they suddenly feel the absence more intensely, but it correlates with the moment the empath truly lets go. When the empath stops waiting, stops hoping, stops energetically holding space for reconciliation, that's when the cord thins. And ironically, that's often when the avoidant feels the loss most sharply, because before there was still an invisible connection keeping things tethered. Now there's movement, there's finality, there's the unsettling realization that the person who once would have stayed through anything is no longer emotionally available, and nothing destabilizes an avoidance pride like realizing access is no longer guaranteed. Then comes the shadow work trigger, and this is where the spiritual lesson intensifies. Losing an empath doesn't just create longing, it forces introspection, because eventually the pattern becomes visible. The distancing, the fear of vulnerability, the discomfort with emotional depth, the push-pull dynamic. When you lose someone who consistently responded with patience instead of manipulation, the usual excuse don't hold up the same way. There's no dramatic betrayal to blame, no explosive toxicity to point at, just your own discomfort with intimacy staring back at you. And that's confronting, because shadow work isn't glamorous. It's not aesthetic. It's sitting alone with the realization that you sabotage what feels safe because safety feels unfamiliar. It's recognizing that you mistake calm love for boredom, because chaos is what you were conditioned to. It's admitting that you felt overwhelmed, not because the empath was too much, but because being fully seen felt terrified. That awareness doesn't always bring immediate change. Sometimes it brings defensiveness first, but once the seed is planted, it grows slowly, persistently, and it asks questions that can't be ignored forever. Regret begins subtly, not as dramatic sorrow, not as grand romantic longing, but as accumulation, small realizations stacking on top of each other, seeing other connections that feel surface level in comparison, noticing that emotional depth isn't easy to find, realizing that vulnerability offered without manipulation is rare, understanding that someone loving you through your walls was not weakness, it was strength. It was strength. And these realizations don't hit in one cinematic moment. They build quietly until one day the weight of them feels undeniable. Regret isn't always about wanting the person back immediately. Sometimes it's about recognizing you mishandled something sacred. Sometimes it's about wishing you had been braver, softer, more honest. And spiritually, regret isn't meant to punish. It's meant to wake up. It's meant to illuminate patterns that need breaking. But waking up hurts, especially when it reveals you were loved in ways you didn't fully value at the time. And then comes the spiritual isolation phase. This is different from chosen independence. This feels heavier because once awareness sets in, distractions don't satisfy the same way. Superficial conversations feel thinner. Casual connections feel less nourishing. The avoidant may withdraw even more, not out of pride this time, but out of confusion because the old strategies don't feel as fulfilling anymore. But vulnerability still feels risky. It's a liminal space, a dark night of the soul type of phase where they're alone not because they want to be, but because they don't yet know how to show up differently. And in that solitude, everything echoes louder. Memories, regret, longing, insight. They may replay conversations in their mind, this time hearing things they didn't catch before. They may finally understand moments when the empath was asking for reassurance and they shut down instead. They may recognize that what felt like pressure was actually an invitation to grow. And that recognition can feel overwhelming because growth requires accountability. And accountability challenges the identity they've protected for so long. But here's the deeper spiritual layer. Isolation is when there's no one to blame, no one to distract with, no one to project onto because you're left with yourself. And that can either harden you further or soften you. The avoidance stands at that crossroads quietly. No audience, no applause, just internal dialogue. They may start consuming content about attachment styles, reflecting on childhood dynamics, noticing how often they equated closeness with loss of control. They may start realizing that pushing away was never about the other person being insufficient. It was about fear of dependency, fear of abandonment, fear of being truly known and then rejected. And that realization is both painful and liberating because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Meanwhile, the empath continues moving forward, healing, strengthening boundaries, elevating standards, and the contrast becomes sharper. The avoidant sees what growth looks like from a distance, and that distance either inspires them or intimidates them because stepping forward would mean admitting they were wrong. It would mean risking vulnerability without knowing if it will be received. It would mean dismantling the I don't need anyone narrative completely, and that's terrifying. But staying where they are feels empty now too. That's the spiritual tension, the space between who they were and who they could become. And that space feels uncomfortable because it requires humility. So if you're the one who loved deeply, who gave patiently, who walked away when your heart was tired, understand this. Your departure triggered something far bigger than silence. It triggered identity collapse. It triggered introspection. It triggered shadow work that can't be undone, even if they never admit it to you, even if pride keeps them quiet. The loss forced them to confront themselves in ways comfort never would have. And that confrontation is sacred because spiritually, some lessons only arrive through absence. Some awakenings only begin when the person who held your emotional hand lets go. And now everything stands on the edge of a decision. They can retreat further into emotional numbness, convincing themselves vulnerability isn't worth it. Or they can allow the isolation to refine them, to teach them, to soften them. The next chapter depends on that choice. But make no mistake, the transformation process has already started. Losing an empath doesn't just create heartbreak. It creates a mirror that lingers long after the reflection is gone. The transformation process has already started, and now it reaches its most defining moment, the soul level realization. This is not loud, it's not dramatic, it doesn't arrive with a sudden confession or a cinematic breakdown. It comes quietly, almost humbly, in a moment of stillness, maybe during a long drive, maybe lying awake at night, maybe after another surface level connection fails to feel the same. It's the realization that what was lost wasn't ordinary. It wasn't just companionship, it wasn't just attention. It was rare emotional safety. It wasn't just attention. It was someone choosing them consistently without trying to control them. It was someone seeing their sharp edges and not running. And when that truth settles in, it hits differently because this time there's no ego narrative strong enough to fully silence it. The avoidant begins to understand that the empathet wasn't chasing, they were loving. They weren't demanding, they were inviting. They weren't overwhelming, they were opening doors that had been locked for years. And that awareness brings both gratitude and grief. Gratitude for having experienced it at all, grief for not knowing how to hold it properly when it mattered most. And once that realization crystallizes, the internal battle begins. This is the crossroads that defines everything. Pride versus vulnerability, fear versus longing, silence versus risk. The avoidant may find themselves hovering over a message box, typing and deleting words they never send. They may imagine what they would say if they reached out. They may rehearse apologies in their mind, but every vulnerable impulse is met with resistance because reaching out would mean admitting the loss mattered. It would mean acknowledging they'd misjudged something sacred. It would mean surrendering the illusion of control. And that is terrifying, especially for someone who built their identity around emotional self-sufficiency. So they wrestle internally, quietly. No one sees this part. No one applauds this growth. It's an invisible war between who they were and who they're being called to become. And the longer they sit in that tension, the clearer the lesson becomes. The clearer the lesson becomes, connection requires courage, love requires receptivity, and safety cannot be experienced fully if it's constantly pushed away. This is where the karmic lesson reveals itself. Spiritually, losing an empath often isn't about punishment. It's about learning how to receive. Avoidants are often good at giving in practical ways, good at providing, good at maintaining structure, but receiving deep emotional love without feeling suffocated, that's the challenge. And the universe, life, whatever you believe in, it has a way of repeating lessons until they're integrated. Losing someone who loved without manipulation forces the avoidant to confront the question, why does healthy love, feel uncomfortable? Why does emotional availability trigger defense instead of peace? And once those questions take root, the cycle can no longer continue unconsciously. They either do the inner work to break it, or they carry the same dynamic into future connections. But the memory of the empath lingers as a benchmark, a quiet comparison, a reminder of what depth actually feels like. And that reminder doesn't fade easily. Now we arrive at the possible outcomes, because this story doesn't have one guaranteed ending. Some avoidants evolve. They lean into the discomfort. They seek understanding. They slowly dismantle their fear of intimacy. And if they ever return, they return different, softer, more accountable, more emotionally literate, not perfect, but aware, and awareness changes everything. Others, however, retreat. They double down on independence. They convince themselves that longing is weakness. They repeat the cycle with someone new, chasing the initial spark while avoiding the depth that once challenged them. But even in repetition, something is different because they've tasted something real. And once you've experienced authentic emotional safety, superficiality doesn't satisfy the same way. It may distract temporarily, but it doesn't anchor. And that quiet dissatisfaction becomes its own teacher. Meanwhile, the empathy experiences a destiny shift. And this part is important because while the avoidant wrestles internally, the empathix rises not in revenge, not in ego, but in alignment. When you stop pouring into someone who can't yet receive you, your energy returns to you, your clarity sharpens, your standards elevate, your boundaries strengthen. The empath begins attracting connections that mirror their growth rather than drain it. And spiritually, this shift closes the loop because the purpose of the connection was never to shrink either person. TT-Touch was to expose what needed healing. For the empath, it was learning to walk away when love isn't reciprocated at the same depth. For the avoidant, it was learning that love is not control, it's vulnerability. And vulnerability is not that weakness, it's expansion. So if you're the one who loved deeply and had to let go, understand this on a soul level, your absence is louder than your presence ever was. Not because you were dramatic, not because you were tense, but because you were safe. And safety is unforgettable, and even for someone who ran from it, even for someone who didn't know how to name it. You planted a seed. Whether it blooms with you or without you is no longer your responsibility. Your responsibility was to love authentically, and you did. And that love doesn't disappear into nothingness. It transforms, it teaches, it echoes. And if you're watching this wondering whether the avoidant ever truly feels it, whether they ever recognize what they lost, whether they ever confront themselves, the answer is yes. Not always immediately, not always outwardly, but spiritually, yes. Because losing someone who held up a mirror with compassion forces a reckoning. It forces identity examination. It forces growth or stagnation, and either path leaves an imprint. The connection becomes a before and after in their emotional timeline, a B, whippers and reason timeline, a preference point for what depth feels like, a reminder that intimacy, when safe, is not something to fear, but something to protect. In the end, what actually happens spiritually when an avoidant loses an empathist, transformation through absence. It is ego confronted by emptiness. It is independence challenged by longing. It is pride wrestling with humility. It is pride wrestling with humility. It is delayed grief turning into awareness. It is a karmic lesson about receptivity, courage, and the cost of emotional avoidance. And for the empath, it is ascension. It is redirection toward de-reciprocity. It is the realization that love should feel safe on both sides, not just one. Some stories circle back, some don't, but none of them leave the same as they began. Because when an avoidant loses an empath, something sacred shifts in both souls. And once that shift happens, neither person is ever truly the same.